Is the mighty British Empire incapable of choosing a prime minister? On the island, 7 prime ministers have changed in just the last 10 years. This is political turmoil unprecedented in the Western world. What about Germany? A decade, 1 chancellor. In the US, only 2 presidents changed, and both completed their full 4-year terms. France saw 3 presidents, but the system never collapsed within months under any of them. Even in Spain, despite having a much more fragile political structure, only 3 prime ministers served in the same period, half as many as England. On the island, the seat changed hands like a punishment. Some lasted not years but months, some only days. Liz Truss's record was 49 days. Even a lettuce bought from the supermarket had a longer shelf life than that. Every new name coming to power right now carries the same fate. The moment they sit in the seat, just like their predecessors, the countdown has already begun. So is the problem, as everyone has memorized, simply Brexit? Or is this just the tip of the iceberg? Finding a culprit is easy, but a system that has burned through 7 names in a decade should now suspect itself, not individuals. Today on Frame, we won't be talking about the Prime Minister crisis in England. We'll be talking about the collapse of the system called the cradle of democracy. Welcome to Frame. You can join us on this journey where we trace the truth by subscribing to Frame. For years, there has been a single cliché tangled on the tongue of global media and political experts. What finished off England was Brexit. But is that really true? Was Brexit the sole disease that paralyzed the island on its own? Or was it the first and loudest symptom of a deep cancer that had already spread through the body, now surfacing? When Prime Minister David Cameron made the decision to hold a referendum in 2016, his concern wasn't really about determining England's future with Europe. Cameron didn't even dream of taking the Queen's country out of the EU. He simply wanted to silence the radical Eurosceptics within his own party, gather the votes of the rising right-wing electorate, and hold on to the Prime Minister's seat. So that massive public referendum that shaped Britain's fate was, at its core, just an internal party power tactic. However, the day the ballot box produced a 52% leave decision, Cameron did not take responsibility for the storm he himself had started, and he resigned the very next morning. The man who opened the referendum was the first name to run away and leave others under the weight of the outcome. That's the day the dominoes began to fall. In fact, everything became clear with that desperate speech Theresa May gave at the podium of the House of Commons. May tried her luck exactly 3 times to get the Brexit agreement through Parliament. In those historic sessions, she crashed into the wall of her own MPs every single time. Outside observers said Brexit brought May down. But the truth was different. The ultra-right ERG group within the party had turned Brexit not into a national project, but into a flawless weapon to topple May from her seat and seize power. Boris Johnson jumped onto this wreckage with a "Get Brexit Done" banner in hand. Brexit carried him to the peak of power. So what brought him down from there? The public's reaction at the ballot box? No. When secret parties held in the Prime Minister's garden while the entire country was locked down in quarantine, that is, the Partygate scandal, broke out, it was again his own MPs who cut his ticket. The man Brexit brought was, once again, taken down by internal party palace coups. When Liz Truss took the stage, the comedy reached its peak. During her record-breaking 49-day short-lived premiership, she announced the budget that sank the pound and dragged the country into economic disaster and then left. But let's put a note here. Which secret buildings and who actually wrote that budget that sank an entire country in those 49 days, we will reveal that in detail in the later parts of this video. This was not a story of public choice or ideological division. It was simply a bloody battle for the seat, wearing the mask of "We're leaving Europe." So while all these palace coups were happening under the crystal chandeliers of Westminster, what was the public doing, paying the bill? England's National Health Service, the NHS, collapsed. The desperation of retirees waiting a full 2 years for a simple cataract surgery or hip replacement made newspaper headlines. Because of train union strikes, people couldn't get to work for weeks. In the freezing winter months, elderly people were forced to choose between buying food for the kitchen and heating the home. What they called the cost of living crisis turned into a nightmare that froze ordinary citizens in their own homes. While politicians played power games in London, the British public paid the price, wondering in their cold homes which bill they would be able to pay. In the same decade, Germany maintained its stability with a single chancellor. The US, meanwhile, saw only 2 presidents. But England burned through a full 7 prime ministers, like a political guillotine operating non-stop. Every time the blade fell, the list took this shape. David Cameron, drowned in the ballot box of the referendum he himself opened. Theresa May, slammed into the wall 3 times by her own party's MPs. Boris Johnson, had his ticket cut by his own MPs over party scandals in which he broke the very rules he'd imposed. Liz Truss sank the pound to the bottom. She could only stay in office for 49 days. So much so that one newspaper broadcast a live stream asking whether a lettuce bought from the supermarket would outlast Truss, and the lettuce won. Rishi Sunak couldn't stop the economic collapse and put his signature on a historic election defeat. Keir Starmer was crushed under growing local scandals and the cost of living crisis and forced to resign. Andy Burnham, and the latest name to take the seat, he too, like his predecessors, has begun waiting his turn under the same guillotine. This picture, fitting into just a few years, is not a record. It's the documentation of the moment the system got stuck. So, on the surface, there's a democracy, but did the public really remove these people from their seats? The answer isn't as simple as you think. So who exactly does this hidden hand belong to? The one that completely sidelines millions of citizens at the ballot box with a single stroke of the pen, toppling entire prime ministers like mere pawns and putting new ones in their place? The answer is hidden in the dark and luxurious back corridors of Westminster, considered the heart of power in London. The 1922 Committee. For someone looking from the outside, this structure looks like an ordinary, extremely boring internal party board. But in reality, it is England's unelected Prime Minister Hunter. It is made up of backbench MPs of the Conservative Party, meaning those who don't sit in a ministerial seat, that is, those who sit in the back rows of Parliament. On paper, their job is to ensure internal party communication and order. But in practice, what they actually do is constantly wait behind the neck of the leader who will govern the country like a sharp guillotine. The name of this structure is no coincidence or ordinary date either. When the calendar showed October of 1922, Conservative MPs gathered at the famous Carlton Club, the main gathering place of London's political elite, brought down the coalition government of the time in a single night and declared their own power. This committee takes its name directly from that historic uprising. So what we call an internal party coup in England today is not an unexpected system malfunction or a momentary crisis. It is a fully 100-year-old, institutionalized, and legitimized palace tradition. The mechanism, meanwhile, is horrifyingly simple. To force a confidence vote on the Prime Minister of an entire country, there is no need at all for the public to gather signatures, take to the streets, or call a general election. It's enough for just 15% of Conservative MPs, which generally amounts to around 48 or 54 letters, to write a secret letter to the committee chairman. The moment those letters reach the critical number in the chairman's safe, the button gets pressed. No ballot boxes are set up, no one asks the public. A leader who has received the votes of millions is removed from his seat in the middle of the night by his own party's MPs. And here is where things get truly much uglier. So who are the ones carrying out these coups and taking over the seat? Those who rule England, those who topple, and those who get toppled have actually never been people from different worlds. Of the 57 prime ministers who have come to power throughout England's history, a full 20 came out of a single high school, Eton College. David Cameron was an Eton graduate, and so was Boris Johnson. Their route after high school never changed either Oxford or Cambridge, that is, the famous Oxbridge network. The relationships formed in the corridors of these schools wrap around not just politics, but also the media, the judiciary, and the world of finance. Like an octopus, secret and elite clubs like the Bullingdon Club, formed in the secluded corners of Oxford and open only to extremely wealthy male students, are places where the future prime ministers, ministers, and media moguls of tomorrow weave their power networks in their youth while popping champagne. Cameron and Johnson were also members of this club during the same period. In short, those fierce political debates, ideological fights, or internal party coups you watch on your screens are not a struggle for democracy or anything like that. It is a vertical power struggle within a small pool of elites who sat on the same high school benches, raised their glasses in the same clubs, and grew up with the same class privileges. Those who topple and those who get toppled are one and the same. And in this aristocratic feud behind closed doors, the public is condemned only to sit in the audience seats. What you've watched up to this point may have seemed to you like nothing more than the infighting of reckless politicians or an elite school club. But when we dig into the depth of the matter, we see that the real crisis stems not from individuals, but directly from the legal loopholes of the system that grants these individuals unlimited authority. The first major legal pillar of this governance crisis in England is hidden in the chilling mathematics within the electoral system itself. The country applies a mechanism called the single-member district voting system, or by its international name, first past the post. In this system, Only a single candidate who receives the most votes in an electoral district comes out of the ballot box, while all other votes go straight to the trash. It might sound simple and practical, but the result of this mathematics on a national scale is a genuine democracy paradox. Thanks to this system, a political party can seize more than 60% of the seats in parliament while receiving only 35 or 40% of the votes nationwide. It would be one thing if this stayed theoretical, but this situation is a bitter reality of British politics. Indeed, we witnessed the most concrete and fresh example of this in the 2024 general election. Despite receiving the votes of only 33.7% of the electorate, the Labour Party managed to seize nearly 64% of the seats in Parliament all on its own. In other words, a party that two-thirds of the electorate did not vote for and rejected obtained an absolute and overwhelming majority in the House of Commons. This is precisely why former Lord Chancellor of England Lord Hailsham, back in 1976, made a famous and shocking diagnosis about this system: elective dictatorship. Lord Hailsham's statement was not an ordinary political complaint or opposition rhetoric. On the contrary, it was an anatomical X-ray of the system. Once you sit in that seat, even if you haven't received the approval of the majority of the public, you hold absolute and unlimited legislative power in your hands. There remains no strong coalition partner in front of you capable of overseeing you or blocking you from passing laws. But the story doesn't end here. The truly dark side of the matter comes right after. There isn't even a single written line of a document that would oversee or rein in this immense, unlimited power. Because England, which prides itself on being the cradle of democracy, doesn't even have a single written constitution like other contemporary states around the world. For years, the sentence, "England has no written constitution, it has centuries of customs and traditions," has been marketed in Western media as if it were an innocent, romantic, and deep-rooted sign of freedom. Yet when you translate this romantic narrative into bare reality, here is the picture you're left with. There is no binding legal text that would tie the hands of power, draw its boundaries, and protect the citizen against the state. The system is entirely entrusted to the good faith and gentleman's word of politicians. We all watched together what happens when politicians decide not to keep that word in the famous prorogation crisis of 2019. The Prime Minister of the time, Boris Johnson, made a mind-boggling move to completely sideline the parliament that was resisting his own Brexit plan, and he suspended parliament for weeks. In other words, he kicked the public's representatives out of the chamber. The matter was carried all the way to the Supreme Court. The court declared Johnson's move unlawful and void and reopened Parliament. But even the court's ruling couldn't hide just how fragile and stretchable the system was. Boris Johnson had used that massive gap created by the absence of a written text and had pushed the boundaries of the system. Because in an order where there is no written rule, no binding constitution, there is also no such thing as breaking the rule. There is only a new custom created according to whatever suits power's interest at that moment. And this situation is no different from an open-ended, infinite check handed to the power holders in London. As if the system's legal loopholes and lack of a constitution weren't shocking enough, when you look at the upper chamber of parliament, you encounter another structure that completely tears down the concept of contemporary democracy: the House of Lords. None of the members here are elected by the public. Even though the 1999 reform limited titles, passed down from father to son, to 92 members, the remaining hundreds of members of the chamber consist of life peers who come through direct political appointment. In other words, this place is a fortress of an unelected aristocracy and appointees in the middle of the 21st century. England is the only country in the world that reserves automatic seats for religious figures in its parliament and is still considered a democracy. The only other governing body in the world comparable to this structure is Iran's Assembly of Experts. 26 bishops belonging to the Church of England, England's official church, that is, the Lords Spiritual, have the right to vote directly in the legislative process, purely thanks to their religious titles, without receiving a single vote from the public. What's more, this structure has turned into an ugly reward your supporters mechanism in the hands of politicians. Thanks to resignation honors, every prime minister who leaves office can appoint his own donors, friends, and advisors as lords for life in this chamber. Both Boris Johnson and Liz Truss, who sank the country in 49 days, filled the House of Lords with their own loyal supporters on their way out, permanently placing them in parliament. This is where the greatest paradox begins. Even though these people, whom the public did not elect, cannot reject laws passed by the House of Commons forever, they have the authority to delay, force revisions on, and paralyze the process for up to a year. An unelected group of political appointees, aristocrats, and bishops can make it difficult to pass the laws of a government chosen by the public. While elected prime ministers in the United Kingdom are being forced out one by one, palace coups unfold in parliament and the public pays the price, a dark machine continues to operate relentlessly behind the scenes, the shadow government. And the loudest cog in that machine is the massive media apparatus that decides what the public should be outraged about. On the morning of the 1992 general election, the right-wing newspaper The Sun hit newsstands with a headline targeting the Labour Party leader. "If he wins today, will the last person to leave Britain please turn out the lights?" 2 days later, when the Conservatives emerged victorious, the paper printed the same arrogant claim across its front page: "It's the Sun what won it." This wasn't merely a media mogul boasting, it was a massive warning shot fired at politics. Whether headlines alone determine elections has always been debated, but after that day, no prime minister dared challenge the ruthlessness of the media empires. Sure enough, when Liz Truss's 49-day premiership collapsed, the same merciless rule was at work. What truly sealed Truss's fate were her amateurish decisions that paralyzed the pound and the financial markets. But the moment the markets began to shake, the media descended upon the wreckage like vultures. One newspaper even live-streamed a contest between Truss's time in office and the shelf life of a head of lettuce. The media may not have been forming governments on its own, but it was perfectly capable of fueling the public hysteria that sent its chosen political target straight to the guillotine in the court of public opinion. But the media was only the noisy storefront of the operation. The radical ideas that gave birth to this disaster were being cooked up just behind Westminster, on a much quieter and darker street. From the outside, it looks like an utterly bleak and ordinary London street, Tufton Street. But once you step through the doors of the unassuming building at 5 Tufton Street, you come face to face with the invisible cabinet that governs Britain from behind the curtain. Hardline free market and radical libertarian think tanks such as the Institute of Economic Affairs and the Taxpayers Alliance, whose funding sources remain shrouded in secrecy, have spent years producing an invisible ideology behind these closed doors. Liz Truss and her chancellor did not invent overnight the radical budget that drove the country into economic disaster. That budget was a ready-made prescription crafted for years in the dimly lit rooms of that building before being handed to politicians. Ministers change, parties collapse, prime ministers are sacrificed. But the unelected advisors on this street continue to shape the state without ever standing in an election. And the foundation on which these ideas are implemented rests upon a far older financial core, one untouched by political turmoil: the City of London. Most people think of Britain as nothing more than a cold island nation in the North Sea. But when you look at the global financial map, Britain sits at the center of the world's largest tax havens, places like the Cayman Islands, Bermuda, and the British Virgin Islands, forming a gigantic financial octopus. And the heart of that octopus is the City of London, an autonomous district surrounded by ancient walls in the very center of London. Here, a strange feudal order governed by medieval rules still prevails. In this district, not only the people who live there vote, giant international banks and financial corporations also cast votes through their representatives. It is a place where corporations have voting rights, protected by legal privileges unlike those in the rest of the country, essentially an independent financial duchy within the state. Britain may have gone through 7 prime ministers in 10 years. Governments may have collapsed, and the system may have become gridlocked. But the autonomous financial core of the city and its network of tax havens continue to move trillions of dollars without being shaken by any political earthquake. Because on this island, politicians are merely temporary actors in the shop window. The real power resides in the think tanks on dark streets, in newspaper headlines, and inside the untouchable steel vaults of the city. This endless battle for power in London is shaking not only England, but the fault lines of the entire United Kingdom. The chronic leadership crisis in Westminster, which has nearly managed to fit a new prime minister into every single year, is steadily eroding confidence in the central government within the devolved parliaments of Edinburgh and Cardiff. Having narrowly lost the 2014 independence referendum, the Scottish National Party (SNP) continues to keep the demand for independence alive by pointing to London's institutional instability and collapse of meritocracy at every opportunity. In Wales, local politicians openly argue that their regions are paying the price for Westminster's power struggles. In Northern Ireland, meanwhile, the delicate sectarian balance remains suspended as London's political counterparts change again and again. The crisis is no longer about who will occupy 10 Downing Street this month. This constitutional deadlock in London now threatens the territorial integrity of the United Kingdom itself. The country stands at the center of a massive force of division, slowly eating away from within. Yet when you look across the global political landscape, one thing becomes clear. Other advanced democracies have built constitutional safeguards that prevent government crises from spiraling into this level of uncontrolled chaos. After World War II, Germany embedded the constructive vote of no confidence, Misstrauensvotum, into its constitution, shielding the executive from personal rivalries and sudden political conspiracies. Under this system, Parliament cannot remove a chancellor unless it first agrees by an absolute majority on a successor. In Germany, bringing down the system is easy, but unless you can prove what will replace it, you won't lay a finger on that chair. France, through the Constitution of the Fifth Republic, granted sweeping powers to both the executive branch and the presidency, preventing parliamentary crises from bringing the state to a standstill. Governments may come and go, but the machinery of the state continues to operate without interruption. The US Constitution, meanwhile, rejects a system where a prime minister can be removed through an internal party vote or a stack of secret letters. Instead, it imposes a fixed presidential term, allowing a president to remain in office until the end of the fourth year and answer only to the voters at the ballot box. Every one of these countries has chosen to guarantee political stability through written, binding, and unambiguous constitutional rules. None of them has an unchecked mechanism like Britain's Conservative Party's 1922 committee, where a leader elected by the public can effectively be forced from office overnight simply because 15% of MPs submitted letters. Britain, by contrast, continues to assume that unwritten 19th century conventions, aristocratic club traditions conducted behind closed doors, and internal party ballots decided by 50 or 60 letters are capable of governing the 21st century. And that constitutional design flaw continues to drive the United Kingdom deeper into a crisis of governance with each passing day. The picture we've assembled piece by piece up to this point is neither the isolated failure of incompetent politicians, nor a momentary lapse in governance, nor a temporary crisis. What stands before us is the system itself, a machine that has been running relentlessly for a century while confronting its own internal contradictions. Looking back, what we see is a massive stage production held together by illusion, an unfair electoral formula that hands an absolute parliamentary majority and enormous powers to parties rejected by two-thirds of the public, a constitutional order without a constitution, shaped and reshaped by politicians to suit their own ambitions, with not a single binding line of text protecting citizens from the state. And in the middle of the 21st century, an unelected aristocracy that, simply by virtue of religious titles or political loyalty, retains the power to delay or revise laws passed by a parliament elected by the people. But when we turn the coin over, we find that behind this political theater lies a far darker and far more unshakable network of shadow power. Radical think tanks that never face the public, never receive a single vote, yet hand ready-made budget blueprints to ministers while keeping their funding sources hidden in the dark. Vast media empires that decide what the public should be outraged about, descending on politicians like vultures with their headlines and fueling waves of public hysteria, and an autonomous financial feudal order within the state that continues to move trillions of dollars, untouched by any political earthquake, even as Britain goes through 7 prime ministers in 10 years. And ultimately, at the center of this constitutional deadlock and these elite power struggles conducted behind closed doors, stands a kingdom whose fault lines have fractured so deeply that it is now questioning whether it can remain a single country on the map. Everything we have discussed is neither a superficial anger over Brexit nor a nostalgic longing for the European Union. The issue goes far beyond individuals, temporary decisions, or momentary political choices. The real issue is how a model that has been packaged and sold to the world for centuries as the cradle of democracy and the fortress of freedom has, through its own internal dynamics and contradictions, become a colossal illusion. When ordinary people pay the price every day for political instability, economic crises, and institutional collapse, while those who make the decisions, produce the ideas, and truly own the system remain in place without ever standing for election or accepting responsibility, that cannot be called democracy. Britain today is not facing an ordinary government or regime crisis. Britain is confronting the reality that the democracy it has proudly carried for centuries and exported to the rest of the world is, in fact, nothing more than a flawlessly engineered illusion. We will continue to follow the invisible machinery behind the system and uncover the bigger picture beyond the media and politics.